Greece versus Persia, 480 BC, the Battle of Thermopylae, the wall that defied eternity. This is the story of a narrow pass where a handful of Greeks faced an empire and decided the world would remember them. Picture the map before the clash. Asia's vastness pours west like a dark tide, and at its head walks Xerxes, king of kings, bringing a force so large that ancient writers couldn't agree on the number. Here is one fact nobody disputes. His army drank rivers dry. Whole valleys emptied their wells to keep the Persian host moving. Now cut to Greece. Not a nation, not yet a patchwork of proud cities that quarrel more than they cooperate. But there's a throat in the mountains called Thermopylae. The hot gates, where the land pinches so tight that even 1,000,000 men must pass in a line. That is where Leonidas of Sparta chooses to stand. You already know the ending in broad strokes, but you don't know the moment that decides it, the quiet hinge in the dark, when one human choice makes the pass either a fortress or a grave. And that choice is coming. Not yet. Listen closer, because history is about to hold its breath. The empire that came for the sea long before the first Greek spear touched Persian bronze. The war began in a place without walls, that it began on water a decade earlier. The Persian Empire had already learned that Greece was not a simple shoreline to be taken. King Darius, Xerxes' father, had sent ships across the Aegean and men onto the beaches of Maratha. They expected the usual outcome, one more restless corner folded into the empire's map. Instead, they found a people who fought like they had nowhere else to go. The Persians withdrew, leaving behind a wound that did not heal in the Persian court. It sat there, quiet and poisonous, in the memory of a dynasty. When Darius died, the empire passed into the hands of Xerxes, and with it passed a question that could not be dodged. Would Persia allow that wound to remain open? Xerxes inherited a realm that was already the largest the world had seen. From the Indus to the Nile, from the Caucasus to the sands of Arabia, nations paid tribute. Roads stitched continents together. Armies moved like seasons. Yet empires do not live on size alone. They live on the story of their size. A king who does not expand is a king who shrinks in the minds of his own people. So the grief of Marathon became policy. The insult of Greece became destiny. But to understand why Thermopylae matters, you have to see how Persia looked at the world. Persia was not a raiding tribe. It was administration turned into muscle. It did not merely conquer. It absorbed. It built satrapies, appointed governors, collected taxes, kept local customs when they were useful. It moved gold, grain, horses, timber, and men across distances that would exhaust any rival. To most of its subjects, Persia was not chaos. It was ordered, with a bowstring behind it. And Xerxes wanted one more piece of order, the Western Sea. Because Greece, to Persia, was a jagged set of rocks in a restless ocean. But those rocks controlled trade routes, harbors, and pride. Their ships could needle the empire's coast. Their defiance could inspire other defiance. If Greece stood unbroken, then other provinces might start imagining they could stand to. So Xerxes planned a campaign not just to punish but to erase the idea of resisting Persia. He did not hurry for years. He gathered men from every corner of his domain. Medes in bright trousers, Bactrians with curved bows, Egyptians with long shields, Phoenicians who knew the sea like skin, cavalry from the steppes, engineers who could throw bridges across rivers, laborers who could cut canals through stone, scribes who could count food by the 1,000,000 mouths. The campaign was a moving city, a moving economy, a moving boast. When it finally rolled west, the earth felt it. Villagers along the route watched dust rise days before the first soldier arrived. Fields were harvested by strangers. Trees were felled to make way for wagons. The invasion was not a spear point. It was a floodplain, and like any flood, it brought a strange kind of confidence. You don't fear a town when you are the ocean. But then there was the sea itself. Persia had learned at Maratha that Greeks were hard to break on land. So this second invasion married land and sea into one act. The army would march along the coast. The fleet would shadow it offshore. Between them, Greece would be squeezed like a grape. That plan needed one thing, a path into Europe wide enough for an empire. The first obstacle was the Hellespont, the narrow strait between Asia and Europe. Xerxes ordered a bridge of ships to be lashed together across the water. Hundreds of vessels, side by side, chained and anchored. A road floating on waves. The sea shattered it. Storms came like a refusal from the gods. The bridge broke apart, and the wreckage drifted like dead wood. Xerxes' reaction was not the anger of a man who had failed. It was the anger of a king who believed nature itself was disobedient. He ordered the water punished. The story says the Hellespont was whipped, chains thrown into it as if to bind the sea. To modern ears, it sounds absurd. To Persian power, it was a message. No element was allowed to say no. New bridges were built. This time, they held. The army crossed. Asia emptied into Europe. At that moment, the war stopped being Greek politics and became Greek survival. News traveled ahead of the Persians like a cold wind. City after city heard it and calculated its odds. Some offered earth and water, the old symbols of submission, because to refuse Persia was to invite ruin. Others hesitated, hoping geography might save them. Greece had mountains, peninsulas, islands. Maybe the empire would tire before it reached you. Maybe it would take another target first. But deep down, every city knew the truth. No wall was high enough for this storm. No harbor was hidden enough from this fleet. In Athens, a man named Themistocles had been warning everyone that Persia would return. He had pushed the city toward ships, toward the sea, toward a future where Athens could fight, not by fields but by waves. When the invasion became certain, his arguments stopped being politics and became prophecy. Athens began to feel like a bow being drawn. In Sparta, the mood was colder. Sparta was built for war. Spartan boys learned hunger before they learned comfort. They learned silence before they learned debate. But Sparta was also built on law and ritual. The city's spine was discipline. And discipline can be both armor and chain. When Persian envoys arrived years earlier demanding submission, Sparta had thrown them into a well. It wasn't just bravado, it was a statement. Sparta does not negotiate with the idea of fear now. As Xerxes approached, Greece looked to Sparta the way a village looks to a fortress, and Sparta looked at its own calendar, a religious festival. The Carnia was near. Spartan law forbade a full army from marching to war during sacred days. To break that law was to break the harmony between city and gods. Some Spartans believed a broken harmony was more dangerous than any Persian spear. So here is Greece's first unbearable paradox. The only army feared by Persia was trapped behind its own piety. The Persian army moved it came down through Thrace and Macedon, swallowing territory without slowing. It did not need to chase victory. Victory traveled with it. Each city that yielded reinforced the idea that yielding was smart. The Greek coalition finally gathered, tense and imperfect. Athenians, Corinthians, Thebans, Spartans, allies on paper, rivals in their blood. They argued about where to make a stand. Northern passes, the open plains, the sea itself. They needed a choke point, a place to turn Persia's size into a disadvantage, and there was one place the map kept whispering back. Thermopylae. A slit between mountain and sea. Hot springs steaming in the rocks. A road so narrow that in places a cart could barely turn. If you held Thermopylae, you held the doorway to southern Greece. You didn't need to kill the ocean. You just needed to hold the gate. But holding the gate required time. Time for the Greek fleet to guard the nearby straits. Time for cities to muster troops. Time for the idea of unity to harden into something real. Sparta could not send its full force yet. But Sparta could send a symbol. So they chose Leonidas. Leonidas was not young. He had lived long enough to know what war costs and what kings owe. He was one of Sparta's two kings, descended from Heracles, carrying a lineage that demanded not comfort but example. He understood the politics behind this stand. He understood the ritual restraints. And he understood, most of all, that if Greece broke here, it might never find the courage to reform. He did not march with an army. He marched with 300 Spartans, hand-picked men who had already fathered sons, men whose names would not disappear if they died. Men chosen not just for skill, but for the shape of the story their deaths could carry. Other Greeks joined him as he traveled, Thespians, Tegeans, Phocians. The numbers grew, but the heart of the force remained those 300, walking like a silent vow. When Leonidas reached the hot gates, he looked at the pass and saw what Persia would not see until it was too late. Here, an empire could not spread its wings. Here, the battle would be human-sized. He ordered a wall repaired. An old Phocian barrier across the narrower stretch, stone on stone, a modest line against a mythic army. Yet the wall was not the real defense. The real defense was what stood behind it, men trained to use the pass like a weapon. Soon Persian scouts appeared on the ridges. Soon dust announced the advance. Xerxes arrived with the confidence of a man stepping onto a stage built for him. He expected terror. He expected negotiation. He expected the gatekeepers to vanish. Instead, he saw Greeks exercising, combing their hair, laughing in the sun as if waiting for games. It unsettled him, not because he feared them, not yet, but because their calm did something dangerous. It made the future feel uncertain. He sent a messenger offering mercy in exchange for submission. He promised Leonidas wealth, status, command, anything a man could want. Leonidas listened, and then answered with a line so spare it cut through the air. Come and take them. It wasn't a speech. It was a door slammed in the face of inevitability. That was the first payoff of Thermopylae. The moment Greece stopped asking what Persia wanted, and started declaring what Greece was. If that line hit you the way it hit Xerxes, like a challenge thrown at fate itself. Keep that feeling close. And when we reach the first clash in the pass, tell me in your own words whether you think Leonidas was brave, or already resigned. Your take matters here, because Thermopylae is not just a battle, it's an argument across time. The hot gates, the morning air was thick with the scent of salt and smoke. Mist crawled along the cliffs, veiling the pass as if the mountain itself wanted to hide what was about to happen. Leonidas stood at the narrowest point, one hand resting on his spear, eyes fixed on the distant shimmer of bronze where the Persian lines gathered like an incoming tide. The pass was smaller than it looked on any map, one road hugging the sea, the other pressed against the cliff. The ground was uneven, stones slick from the hot springs that gave Thermopylae its name. The water bubbled quietly nearby, whispering like a prophet. To the men, that sound was eerie comfort, a reminder that even as empires marched, the earth still breathed. By dawn, scouts returned with reports. The Persian front stretched farther than sight allowed. Campfires burned all the way to the horizon. The sound of drums and voices rolled through the valley like thunder in slow motion. But the Greeks didn't retreat. They tightened their ranks, shields locking, spears angled, faces calm. Leonidas walked through the lines without armor on his head. No crown, no robe, just a soldier among soldiers. When he passed, men stopped talking. They didn't shout, they didn't bow. They simply watched the way one might watch a flame in darkness. He didn't speak long. Remember what stands behind you, he said. Not walls, not kings, but your sons, your names, your land. Then, quieter, and remember what stands before you, men who believe they cannot die. The words landed like a quiet spark, not to inflame, but to steady. At midday, the Persians advanced. The first wave were the Medes, proud, disciplined, troops from the empire's core. They moved in perfect ranks, confident that numbers alone would crush resistance. The narrow pass, however, turned their advantage into chaos. Shields collided, spears tangled, and soon they were packed too tightly to move. The Greeks fought in rhythm, shield forward, thrust, withdraw, step. Every motion rehearsed since boyhood. Spears pierced throats and shoulders. Shields slammed against armor. Fallen men had nowhere to fall but onto each other. From his vantage, Xerxes watched the slaughter unfold with disbelief. His best troops were being pushed back by what? A wall of red cloaks. 1,000 men, maybe less. He sent more. The immortals marched next, the elite of the Persian army. Soldiers whose number was said never to change. For every man who died was instantly replaced. Their armor gleamed like gold under the sun, their faces hidden behind polished masks. When they entered the pass, silence fell, broken only by the hiss of the sea. They came in precision. They died in confusion. The Greeks let them come close, then pressed forward as one living wall. The clash sounded like hammers on iron. The narrow terrain forced the immortals to fight one by one, and in that confinement, their legend withered. Spears snapped, shields splintered, but the red line held. For 2 days, the battle repeated in brutal rhythm. Charge, crash, retreat, silence. Corpses piled so high that both armies had to drag them aside just to make room to fight. And yet, between those moments of chaos, there was an eerie stillness. At night, the Greeks tended their wounded in the flicker of firelight. The hot springs steamed. The mountain breathed. From the Persian camp came the low hum of drums and the crackle of torches. 1,000 shadows moving like one restless creature. On the second night, as wind scraped through the rocks, a man approached the Persian lines, a Greek, shrouded in cloak and dust. His name was Ephialtes. He had once lived near Thermopylae, knew its paths and folds like a hunter, and he had been turned away by the Spartans when he offered to fight beside them. Too weak, too disfigured, they said. Pride wounded, he came now to Xerxes with a secret. There is another road, he told the Persians. A path through the mountain. Xerxes listened. His eyes, dark and unreadable, barely moved. But when the traitor pointed to the ridges behind the pass, a flicker of satisfaction crossed the king's face. That night, while the Greeks slept against their shields, a column of Persian soldiers began to climb. Torches flickered along the mountain trail, weaving like fireflies through the trees. The path was steep, the air cold, the silence enormous. Each step was a theft of destiny. At dawn, a Phocian detachment guarding the trail awoke to the sound of leaves cracking. By the time they realized what was happening, the Persians were already above them. Arrows rained down. The Greeks broke and scattered. The mountain had betrayed its defenders. Down below, the first light of morning touched the pass. Leonidas felt the change before he saw it, a stillness too deep, a shift in the air that warriors recognize like instinct. He looked toward the ridges, and there, faintly, saw movement. When the messenger arrived breathless, the truth was already written in Leonidas' face. They were surrounded. He gathered his commanders. Some urged retreat, the pass was lost, the mountain compromised. Others argued to hold as long as they could to buy time for the rest of Greece. Leonidas listened, silent. Then he said, "Go, those who wish to go. This ground has already chosen me." Most stayed, not because of orders, because leaving would mean carrying a story no man wanted to live with. The third morning came like prophecy. Persian drums pounded from both directions. The hot gates trembled. Spears glinted in every shadow. Leonidas stood at the center, helmet lowered now, face hidden. When the signal was given, the Greeks charged not with shouts, but with a sound that began low, a growl from the throat of history itself. They met the Persians in a storm of bronze and fire. Shields cracked, bodies collided, arrows darkened the sky. Leonidas fought in silence, moving like the rhythm of war itself. Thrust, step, turn, strike. Then came the arrow that found him. No one saw where it came from, only that suddenly he was down, blood mixing with dust. The Spartans surged around him, forming a living ring. They fought not for victory now, but to keep his body from being taken. When the Persians finally broke through, they found a wall of corpses guarding a single fallen king. Even in death, Leonidas seemed to stare through the enemy, not with fear, but with the quiet defiance of a man who had already won something greater than survival. By noon, the pass was silent again. Smoke drifted over the sea. The mountain wind carried the scent of ash and salt. Xerxes walked among the dead. He looked down at Leonidas' body and gave the order to display his head, a gesture meant to erase the symbol. But symbols don't obey kings. Far away, in Athens, a message was already spreading. Thermopylae had fallen, yes, but the empire had bled for every step, and the spirit that stood in the pass was not buried there, because now, for the first time, Greece was no longer many cities. It was one wound, one anger, one vow. And as Xerxes turned his gaze south toward Athens, a fleet of wooden ships waited on the horizon, waiting for wind, for vengeance, and for the echo of Leonidas' last stand to reach the sea. The war was not over. It was only changing shape. 3 days of stone and fire. The sea was restless that morning. Dark waves clawing at the rocks below the pass. Smoke still rose from the battlefield like a prayer that would not end. Among the fallen, the wind whispered through broken spears. And from the cliffs, the Persian army began to move again, not marching now, but sweeping, as if they were trying to erase something written into the earth. Word of the slaughter at Thermopylae spread faster than horses could run. Every village from Thessaly to Attica knew what had happened before the ashes cooled. They spoke of Leonidas and his 300 not as dead men, but as a wall that still stood somewhere in spirit, refusing to fall. In the Persian camp, Xerxes sat in silence. He had won, yet victory did not taste clean. The Greeks had not broken as other nations had. They had not begged, not even as the spears closed around them. And now, in every corner of his empire, the story of Thermopylae was being told in tones too proud for a conquered people. The more Xerxes tried to bury that past beneath his triumph, the more it burned its shape into memory. Still, he had an empire's momentum behind him, and the road to Athens lay open. The walls of Greece were broken, or so he believed. His fleet shadowed the coast, black sails blotting out the horizon. Wherever the army passed, cities surrendered, their temples stripped, their altars silent. Yet something was shifting in the air, a rhythm too quiet to notice at first. The rhythm of resistance finding its breath again. In Athens, that rhythm had a name, Themistocles. While the Spartans had held the pass, Themistocles had been building something else, not of stone, but of wood. A fleet 200 triremes carved and reinforced for one purpose, to turn the sea itself into a weapon. He understood what Leonidas had bought them: time, and something rarer than time, unity. Now that unity hung by a thread. Refugees poured into Athens as news of the Persian advance reached the city. Mothers carrying children, old men clutching heirlooms. The sky above the Acropolis turned red with sunset and smoke. The council gathered in the shadow of the Parthenon. Arguments broke like waves: fight here, abandon the city, hold the walls, defend the shrines. Themistocles stood apart. his gaze fixed on the horizon. He knew the Persians would come not only by land, but by sea, and if Athens fell before their ships met, Greece itself would be choked. "Stone can burn," he said quietly, "but the sea can swallow kings." He proposed the unthinkable: to abandon Athens, to trust the ships, to draw Xerxes into a place where his numbers would become a curse. The island of Salamis lay nearby, narrow channels hemmed by cliffs. The Persians would see it as an easy trap. Themistocles would make them believe it. When the first Persian vanguard reached Athens, the city was almost empty. Only a few priests and defenders remained on the Acropolis, guarding sacred fire. They fought as long as they could, but by nightfall the Persians had scaled the walls, looting temples, burning statues, and planting their banners where gods once watched. Xerxes ordered the city burned. From his throne on the hill he watched flames consume marble. But across the strait, from the decks of the waiting Greek fleet, the Athenians watched too, not with despair, but with a fury that burned colder. Themistocles stood at the prow, the reflection of fire flickering in his eyes. "Now," he whispered, "they believe they've won." For days, both sides waited. The Persian fleet dwarfed the Greek one, stretching like a forest of masts across the sea. Themistocles sent a messenger secretly, deliberately, to Xerxes, pretending to betray his own allies. The message said the Greeks were frightened, planning to flee at dawn. Xerxes took the bait. Before sunrise, he ordered his ships into the strait to block their retreat. What he didn't know was that the Greeks had anchored silently in the dark, their oarsmen ready, their captains waiting for the signal. Then came the cry, a sound that ripped across the water like a heartbeat of vengeance. "Sons of Greece, strike for your freedom." The oars plunged, the triremes leapt forward, the narrow channels turned the sea into a furnace. Persian ships collided with each other, their numbers now a prison. The Greek vessels darted in and out, bronze rams smashing into holes, splinters exploding like thunder. Oars snapped, men screamed, waves churned red. From the cliffs above, Xerxes watched in disbelief as his fleet collapsed in the very place he thought victory was certain. His generals shouted orders that the wind carried away. His pride, the arm of his empire, broke apart in a storm of wood and fire. Themistocles stood at the bow of his ship, soaked in spray, face set like stone. "For Thermopylae," he said, as his vessel rammed another Persian hull. By dusk, the sea was littered with wreckage. The survivors clung to floating debris, their cries lost in the wind. The Greeks did not cheer. They only stared at the burning horizon where Xerxes' dream began to sink. The king left Greece soon after, leaving part of his army behind under Mardonius, a final effort to crush what remained. But Xerxes himself, once so certain the world would bend, turned homeward across the bridge he had built, now cracked and trembling under the weight of retreat. And yet, in the silence that followed, something still haunted both sides, the feeling that Thermopylae was not finished. Because legends don't end in fire. They end in the silence afterward, when men look at what they've done and wonder what it means. In Sparta, mothers who had lost sons at the hot gates carried that silence like armor. In Athens, sailors returned from Salamis with salt on their faces and disbelief in their eyes. They had won, yes, but they all felt the same strange truth. The cost of holding the line was still unfolding, rippling outward like waves from a single drop of blood on stone. And as the survivors of Persia limped eastward, a new message traveled faster than any army. Across valleys, across coasts, whispered at firesides and carved into memory. The wall had fallen, yes, but the wall had not failed. Somewhere beyond the horizon, another storm was forming, the kind no one could see yet, a reckoning between what was lost at Thermopylae and what Greece was about to become. And in that unseen space between victory and vengeance, one question began to grow like a shadow. If 300 men could stop an empire for 3 days, what might an awakened nation do to end it forever? The traitor's path night in the mountains carried its own kind of silence, a silence that didn't rest, but listened. The Persians still camped in Greece, fires smoldering like distant stars, while their king sailed homeward, half victor, half shadow. The wind that crossed the passes still remembered screams, still carried the scent of burned olive and iron dot. In that silence, the name of Ephialtes began to crawl like a curse. The man who had shown Xerxes the hidden path, the man who had unmade the wall that defied eternity. He thought he would be rewarded. He imagined Persian gold, a new home, songs written in his name. But treachery doesn't buy peace, it rents it. When the war tide turned, when Persia began to retreat, the promise vanished. Gold became whispers. Whispers became fear. Ephialtes fled north, hunted not by armies but by memory itself. Every road he took led to the same question that haunted him. If the Greeks had lost, Why did he feel like the defeated one? In the valleys below, the Greek cities stirred again. The victories at Salamis and the retreat of Xerxes had reignited something old, the idea that freedom was more than survival. Yet Persia still held men, land, and vengeance within Greece. Mardonius, the general Xerxes left behind, camped near Thebes with a force large enough to strike once more. Winter passed heavy, slow. Armies healed, rebuilt, whispered of what would come when the snow melted. In Sparta, the council waited for word. Would they march again? Would they avenge Leonidas, or let the sea victory suffice? Some argued the war had already been won. Others, quieter but fiercer, said the war would never be over until the land that drank Spartan blood was cleansed by it. One morning, a messenger rode through the mist to Sparta, his horse half dead from exhaustion. He brought a single piece of news. Mardonius was rebuilding the Persian line in Boeotia, calling Greece to kneel once more. The Persians had burned Athens again. That was the spark. When the call went out, no one hesitated. Thousands gathered: Athenians, Spartans, Plataeans, men from cities that had once hated each other now stood shoulder to shoulder. They called it unity. Others called it revenge. Among them was a young Spartan named Damaris, whose father had died at Thermopylae. He wore his father's shield, its edge still scarred by Persian blades. On the march north, he often caught himself staring at the mountains in the distance, wondering which of those ridges had swallowed Leonidas' last breath. The army moved like a river through the land that had been broken by war. They passed burned farms, temples stripped bare, orchards black with ash, but each ruin made them harder. By the time they reached Plataea, the land of the next reckoning, there was no debate left in them. The Persians were waiting. Their camps spread across the plains, a city of silk and iron, banners high, horses restless. Mardonius had chosen his ground well, wide fields where Persian cavalry could move freely. He wanted to lure the Greeks into open battle, to drown them in numbers before they could build walls of their own. The first days passed in uneasy stalemate. The Greeks held the high ground, refusing to descend. The Persians taunted them, sending riders close enough to loose arrows, then retreat. Every night, both sides watched the same stars and counted the same hours, knowing dawn could mean the end. Damaris waited with the Spartan line. He spoke little. At night he cleaned his father's spear and whispered the name Leonidas as if the dead could still hear. Around him, men murmured prayers, not for life, but for worth. Then came the rain. It fell without mercy, turning the fields to mud. Supplies ran low, water fouled, tempers cracked. Themistocles was gone, the fleets far away. Here, there were only men, hunger, and waiting. Some wanted to retreat to better ground. Others feared the retreat would become a rout. On the 12th night, Mardonius acted. Under cover of darkness, Persian troops slipped around the Greek flank, cutting the supply lines, poisoning wells. When dawn came, the Greeks were starving, half dehydrated, and forced to move. It was exactly what Mardonius wanted. He saw the lines breaking and sent his cavalry forward, confident this would be the blow that scattered them. But the Greeks, though separated, did not flee. They turned and locked shields. What followed was chaos, brutal and wordless. The Persians pressed forward, their archers raining death. Yet the Greeks kept advancing, step by step, shields grinding through mud. Damaris fought near the front, the rhythm of his father's lessons echoing through his arms. Strike, block, thrust, breathe. Around him, men fell, but the line did not collapse. It flexed, absorbed, then surged. Mardonius himself rode into the melee, his armor shining, his voice rising above the roar. For a heartbeat, it seemed the Persian tide might push the Greeks back into the hills. Then, a stone, some say from a sling, some say from fate, struck Mardonius in the skull. He fell without a word. The moment his body hit the ground, the Persian front wavered. What began as battle became panic. When the smoke cleared, the plain of Plataea was silent. The Persian camp burned, and the Greeks stood among it, too exhausted to cheer. The war that had begun at Thermopylae had found its balance. The wall that had fallen in the mountains now rose again in the plains. But even as victory spread across the fields, Damaris climbed a small rise and looked west, toward the ridges of Thermopylae barely visible on the horizon. He imagined the past still echoing with war, still haunted by ghosts who refused to leave. And far away, in a forgotten cave along those cliffs, a ragged figure shivered in the dark. Ephialtes the traitor, hearing distant bells from the valley, realized what the sound meant. The Greeks had won. The empire he'd betrayed his people for was broken. His reward was only memory and the knowledge that his name would outlive him, not as legend, but as warning. When they found him days later, the story says he didn't fight. He only looked at the soldiers sent to capture him and whispered, "I thought I was saving myself." Then he smiled once, small and strange, as if he'd finally understood, something no one else ever would. The wind took his last breath into the same mountains where Leonidas had made his stand. The traitor and the king, two men who chose different paths through the same fate, and yet, even with Persia's defeat and Greece's freedom, the war did not end in the world's heart. It only sank deeper, quieter, the struggle between fear and defiance, empire and idea, because while armies could win battles, something larger had begun at Thermopylae, something no spear could kill. The story was spreading beyond Greece now, whispered along trade routes, carried by sailors, retold in foreign tongues, and somewhere far to the east, in a palace built of gold and grief, a message reached the last courtiers of Xerxes. The king of kings was dead, but what he'd tried to crush was not, and across the sea, the sons of those who had fought at the hot gates were already dreaming of new walls, not of stone, but of destiny. The world was about to change again. The echo that outlived the army the war had ended. But the sound of it didn't. It clung to the land, the whisper of armor beneath the soil, the hollow echo of marching feet that would never come again. Even when the smoke cleared, the memory of Thermopylae refused to fade. It lingered not as defeat, but as something sharper, cleaner, immortal. Years passed, empires shifted, yet every traveler who crossed the hot gates stopped to look. The stones were still warm from the springs, the same scent of salt and iron still hung in the air. And there, carved into the rock where Leonidas had fallen, stood the words left behind by those who understood what he had done. "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." That message survived even when the men who wrote it were forgotten. It was not an epitaph, it was a command. In the markets of Athens, the name Thermopylae began to mean something beyond geography. Mothers spoke it when teaching their sons the meaning of courage. Statesmen invoked it when arguing about freedom. Even poets found themselves drawn to it because it was no longer just a battle, it was an idea. But ideas, like sparks, need kindling. And Greece was not done burning. The victory at Plataea had freed the land but left the air heavy with pride. The cities that once fought side by side began to look at each other again with suspicion. Athens, now powerful with its navy and wealth, started building an empire of its own. Sparta, whose pride was built on discipline, saw danger in Athens' ambition. The allies who had faced Persia as brothers now sharpened their words like knives. In that fragile peace, the ghost of Leonidas became a mirror. To some, he was the perfect symbol of unity, proof that Greeks could stand as one. To others, he was a reminder that even heroes die when cities refuse to yield to each other. The same fire that had defied Persia now threatened to consume Greece itself. Still, the world beyond watched. In Persia's courts, couriers brought stories of Greek independence and the strange power of small nations who refused to kneel. Some called it madness, others, quietly, called it terrifying. The empire had won and yet lost. Its armies had conquered the ground, but not the story, and the story was spreading. From Egypt to Babylon, whispers began to travel with merchants, of warriors who held a mountain pass for 3 days against a sea of men, of a king who fought until his breath ran out, not for conquest, but for meaning. Those who heard it didn't need to know the names, they only needed to understand the shape of it. That sometimes a single stand can outlive the empire that crushed it. But legends are dangerous things. They make men believe in themselves even when they shouldn't. In the decades that followed, a new generation grew up under the shadow of those legends. Boys who had never seen a Persian helmet still dreamed of Thermopylae. One of them, a prince from Macedon, listened to stories of Leonidas and the gods of old with a fascination that bordered on worship. His name was Alexander. He would one day take that same defiance east across the same lands where Xerxes once marched and turned the empire that had threatened Greece into dust. Some say that when Alexander reached the ruins of ancient Persian capitals, he stood in silence for a long time, as if he were hearing voices from the past. Perhaps he heard the echo of the hot gates in the wind. Back in Greece, the pass itself changed with the seasons, but not with time. Wildflowers grew between the stones where the Spartans had fallen. Travelers who came seeking glory found only quiet, the kind that humbles you. Even the sea, once violent against the cliffs, now lapped gently as if paying respect. One evening, an old soldier named Damaris, long retired, made that journey. His hair was grey now, his armor left behind, but he still carried the same shield his father had held at Thermopylae. He came not to fight, but to remember. He knelt by the carved stone and touched the letters with his calloused hand. Around him, the air shimmered with heat rising from the springs, the same warmth that had once curled through the battle smoke. He closed his eyes and thought he could still hear voices, the low murmur of Spartans laughing before dawn, the clash of bronze, the cry that began when the first Persian wave hit and never truly stopped. He stayed there until the sun sank behind the cliffs, painting the sky in red and gold, the colors of both victory and blood. And when he finally stood to leave, he whispered not a prayer, but a promise. We held. The wind took the words, and carried them east, across the mountains, across the plains, across the graves of kings, and somewhere far beyond the lands of Greece, where the ruins of Persia slept beneath sand and silence. The same wind passed through broken pillars and hollow halls, through what was once called eternal. It whispered the truth no empire can outrun, that eternity belongs not to conquerors, but to those who stand when they cannot win. The past remains, the water still steams, the stones still remember the weight of shields. Time itself bends around that place, unwilling to erase it. For every age finds its own Thermopylae, its own narrow gate between what must be defended and what cannot be lost. And maybe that is why the story endures. Because somewhere, even now, someone stands before overwhelming odds, staring down their own version of the impossible, and finds courage not from victory, but from the echo of a wall that once defied eternity. The hot gates still whispered out, and the world, though changed, still listens.